All right, welcome everyone. This is round two of our live stream. I started 5 minutes ago and realized I didn't hit the go live button, but we're live now. And sorry we're late, 5 minutes late, but things seem to be working. Thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Camden Bucey. I'm in studio in Libertyville, Illinois, here at the RFHQ. We've got a great group of people with us today. We're going to be talking about some really fun and exciting things, mostly following up with this morning's episode of Christ the Center, in which Carlton Wynn, Lane Tipton, and I discussed Keith Matheson's new book, Toward a Reformed Apologetics, a critique of the thought of Cornelius Van Til. So let me go around the horn and introduce everyone today, and we'll get into some news items, and then we'll start talking about the episode and answering some questions from the live chat. We have first, to my left in the virtual space and literally in physical space. I could put my hand in front of the camera and you'll see it. We have Ryan Noha, our Director of Education and Advancement. Welcome, Ryan. It's great to have you here in the studio.
Thank you, Camden. I'm delighted to be here for this conversation. Can't wait to hear from the brothers.
We're working with an odd mix of things to get things working. So if you're watching the live stream and when Ryan's talking, my video panel is highlighted. Don't worry, it's just because we're plugged into the same audio device, and only one of us can select that as our device. Uh, we'll work on this in the future, so don't be confused. I'm not throwing my voice or casting my voice or vice versa. Ryan isn't doing anything. No magic here.
I
Nothing.
wouldn't know how to do
You
it.
wouldn't know how
Yeah,
to do
so
it anyway. We no demons in this place. We're inhabited by the Spirit of Christ, so we're thankful for that. We also have with us Lane Tipton, our fellow of biblical and systematic theology. He's also pastor of Trinity OPC in Easton, Pennsylvania. Welcome, Lane. It's good to see you too.
Hey, great to be back. Very excited about this.
Yeah, we've been busy. We've done the Van Til group. We've already recorded a Voss group that'll air next Friday.
hmm
And happy to have you here live and looking forward to talking. We also
Absolutely.
have Scott Cook, our dear friend. Scott certainly teaches apologetics at Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. But remind me, Scott, of the specific name of your church. He's got a really great name, but it's not it's not Grace, it's not Providence, it's not Covenant or Redemption. So it's the name of a location though, and I don't have it in front of me.
Yeah, that's right. We tried to find a name that hadn't been taken before, so we just took the name of the county. It's Oconee Presbyterian Church. We're in the
Oconee, that's
most
right.
northwest county in South Carolina. So
I knew that.
thanks so much for
Very
having
good.
me here. It's great to be with you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and thanks for joining us. I couldn't be happier to have this group. We've talked about it before when Scott has been on Christ the Center, but this is reminding me of one of my favorite dinners I've ever had in my entire life. It was the four of us.
Hey,
So
Yep.
Camden, I got to cut you off before you talk about Sergio because folks can't hear you very well.
they
I'm
can't
getting-
hear me.
Yeah, both of us. They're saying they can barely hear us, and I don't want to give Sergio short shrift. So
Absolutely. He
for
he
some
must be
honor,
told. His story must be
All right.
explained.
we want to issue a certain sound about
Yeah.
that man's excellence.
So let's see here. Check, check, check. Test, test, test. You see, it's like we've
Test,
never
1, 2, 3.
recorded before. Well, you guys will be fine. It's just
Good,
us
okay.
that are working on a
Right.
different device here. That's 20 decibels a gain on that. Let's see
All right,
here.
let's crank it up.
Are they saying it's any better? No.
I hear Ryan better
Check,
myself.
check, check,
Okay.
check. Testing,
Mhm.
testing, testing.
And Camden.
Turn me up. Turn me up.
Check, check, check. Are we? Is that any better? Okay, Ryan should be able to be. He should be just as loud. I can always increase Ryan. Ryan, can you say something, Ryan?
Yes, I can say something. Yeah, I'm delighted to see so many friends in the chat there. It's great.
Okay, sorry about that. Thanks everyone. This is why we have a live chat. Make sure all this is working. Again,
Okay, it's
I'm getting used to this, and things are goofy here, but most all this is done in post production, where we handle all the levels, the normalization, the compression, all that kind of stuff, and doing it live is another layer. So we've got all this great equipment, but we haven't had a whole lot of practice at doing multiple people live. So thanks for bearing with us. Hopefully this sounds good and looks good.
I like the authenticity of the new thing, Camden. So this is great for me. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, you appreciate. Yeah, we get to see how the sausage
Yeah.
is made, warts and all, mixing metaphors here. That's great. So to get back to this dinner, I was just reminded, because it was a couple days ago. I don't know if you brothers use iPhones. I presume most of you do, but you know how it will often with iCloud show you pictures from the past. I think I was with you, wasn't I? And I showed you. Yeah, it popped up the morning. Ryan and I were traveling, and it popped up this picture that we took from a dinner. We had a celebratory dinner when Lane finished teaching our 8-part series on our Fellowship of Reformed Apologetics. He taught 8 courses on the theology and apologetics of Cornelius Van Til. That was, certainly an occasion for us to have a good time and to mark that occasion in the history of Reformed Forum. So we went out to a fairly nice dinner. We went down into Chicago. And Scott was with us watching the class. He was kind of auditing the class. We don't do courses for credit, but he was with us, hanging with us. And Ryan and I were working the cameras and taking notes and doing all that stuff. But we had just a wild time. And the guy taking care of us, he was kind of a host, kind of the sommelier, kind of an all-around dude. But he was spinning a yarn for us. He was presenting himself as a kind of an Italian named Sergio, but we found out he was a Russian.
St. Petersburg, yeah, that's right.
It was crazy.
The Russian waitress ratted him out, but the beautiful thing about it all was that dinner was amazing, and we're like, he's telling us about this fantastic wine he wants us to get and all this other stuff, then I'm looking it up online and finding out that he's selling us a used car here. And over and over and over, he was just telling a story. But the beautiful thing about it was I didn't care, because what he was doing was creating an experience.
Yep.
And basically a lot of this stuff, if it tastes good to you in the moment, that's great. So he was doing that, and he was the epitome of being a good host and making for a good time, even though he was lying in the process. I've since tried to find the guy. That restaurant sadly is closed down, maybe because they were lying about other stuff. I don't know, but
it was Count of Monte Cristo light. He was just spinning the yarn. It was amazing.
Yeah. I'm kind of thankful that I can't go back. I tried to go back to the restaurant and find the guy again. I'm kind of glad I can't, because it makes for a better memory.
Yeah.
You know how it is whenever you meet your heroes sometimes, or if you go back to something that was just this great memory and it just never can live up. So I kind of enjoy the fact that we can't do that. He
can remain mysterious, amazing, like Melchizedek in Genesis 14, right?
No beginning, no ending. Yeah, that's very good. Yeah. Well, today we're going to talk about the episode today. I'm going to ask Lane a few questions. We're going to answer your questions from the live chat. But I do want to mention we've got a great new book. We haven't even talked about it on the program yet. This is a galley-proof copy. You see it says not for resale, but the copies you buy won't say that. But maybe somebody wants this one. I've got also some wrong sized ones I ordered at one point that had the wrong trim size. There's 3 of those. So Ryan would say those are the highly prized collector's items now. It's like
1 out of 3.
Yeah, when you used to collect baseball cards, sometimes you'd get an error card that had like a typo on it or something like that. Those were what you wanted. So there are a few of those out there, but we have here a new book, Union with Christ, The Benefits of His Suffering and Glory by Lane G. Tipton. This is a companion book that is based on the material of his Union with Christ course that's available for free through our Reformed Academy, both at reformedforum.org as well as on YouTube. That course has been out for a couple of years. It's an excellent course, but now if you want a book that goes along with it, you can certainly do that. The book stands on its own. You could just read it. You don't have to take the course. It's not as if the book is presupposing that you've watched the videos or vice versa. You could just take the course. But I think it's best to have the 1-2 punch of both. And then the book also includes study questions and a looking forward section at the end of each chapter. So it's very suitable for like a study group, and it's rich. It's theologically accessible, but it's certainly deeper than your typical kind of just like basic conservative evangelical study guide, so it's got some meat to it. So if you're looking for something maybe for a men's group or officer training, or if you just, been cutting your teeth on a lot of Crossway or maybe Ligonier material and you want something that's going to, have a little bit more girth to it, I suppose, theologically, then this is what you want. Union with Christ, the benefits of his suffering and glory. And watch the course. It's free. Course is free. So here's my suggestion. Pick this for your men's study at church or women's study, whatever you want to do. And then watch the course together for free, but buy a bunch of these and just give these out to the people. And then you're hitting your marks. Watch the video before you meet together, read the book, then gather together and talk and work through the discussion questions. It's like a class in a box. Easy, right, Ryan? What would you say?
Absolutely. Well, the one thing I would add is that Lane very self-consciously goes through the Westminster Shorter Catechism, beginning with the questions on effectual calling. And how is it that we're made partakers of this redemption that Christ has wrought? And so that's a fantastic compliment to a catechism class too, if you really want to go deeper.
That's good.
Let me mention too, you brought up the fellowship in Reformed apologetics, especially as we were talking all about idealism. You guys were talking about it earlier today. Mm-hmm. As part of that fellowship in Reformed apologetics, Lane has a 5-hour, 49-minute class just on Van Til and his trenchant, consistent throughout his whole corpus critique of idealism. And he goes way deep, getting into Kant and Hegel, the Boston personalists, the British guys. It's a fantastic course, all for free. So I commend that to you for study.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no excuse. So if you want to understand Van Til, there's all the books that are out there, but we have free courses that are the world's greatest courses. I don't say that out of pride. I'm saying we have one of the, if not the greatest expert on the material, and we put the material out there for free. So there's no excuse to following up with this stuff. And you can watch a 5-hour course a lot faster than you can read a 200-page book. So there you go, at least me. So the material's there. It's free. We're going to be talking about that stuff today. So I want to fire off maybe Lane and ask you a question first. And Scott, you know how things work here. Feel free to jump in and talk. This is an open forum discussion, so don't feel like you need to ask me. I don't want to act as moderator, even though I kind of naturally do after 1,000 of these. But Lane, we went for about an hour 38 in that episode, and that's supposed to be the first of maybe 4 episodes. But maybe I'd love for you, I know we talked about some of this in the episode, but maybe you could provide a little background, because you and Keith had been talking in advance. You've been talking since that episode was recorded, and even in advance of this episode coming out. But I want to eventually get to perhaps that last bucket that we talked about, because since we were already going an hour 38, a lot longer than our typical hour, I don't know if you wanted some time or maybe to continue to amplify or expand upon your final point there, but take it as you will, and let us know. Give us a window into the background of what's been going on.
Sure. Just the window with regard to my relationship with Keith. It's a very good relationship, dear brother in the Lord. And he had called me, emailed me a couple of years ago, letting me know he's going to write the book, and wanted to know if I would read it and give him some input and some interaction. And we talked, I don't even know how many times. I remember 2 very distinct long conversations, very good, very productive. And we did talk about Van Til's doctrine of God, and we talked a lot about Van Til and idealism. And it was a fruitful dialogue. And the thing that struck me about Keith's, and I said this, I believe, in our opening installment last week, or that aired today, he's a gentleman and a scholar and a dear brother in the Lord, and I really appreciate his demeanor in getting at this and setting forth an argument that's critical of Van Til. I do think he centers idealism. I think there are other buckets that we're going to talk about: image of God, sin, common grace, natural revelation, theistic proofs, Trinity, and a host of other things. We'll fit those in the other buckets. But I did, Camden, thank you for doing this. I did, there was a quote or two that I wanted to read from Van Til with regard to the coherence theory of truth that we didn't get to. And I don't want to read long quotations right now because we're live. I don't want to bore people. But one of the things that I didn't say that I think's worth saying just to fill out the picture is that in SCE 1 through 2, and if I said this, guys, I'm sorry I forgot, but I don't think I did. Van Til's got a quote where he actually speaks of his view as a correspondence theory of truth. And let me explain real briefly. He says, it is this concept of a completely self-conscious God that is all important in epistemology. I know we raised that point. In the struggle between the realist and the subjective idealist, this was the only question in dispute. I'll pause. In other words, between the idealist and the realist, the question was, how does the finite mind relate to the finite object? The realist says it discovers the object. The idealist says it either makes the object intelligible or constitutes the object, depending on how strong the idealism is. That's the debate, finite mind versus finite objects, picking up Van Til. He said they were not concerned about the question uppermost in our minds, whether or not God has to be taken into the correspondence. We may call our position in epistemology a correspondence theory of truth, if only we keep in mind that it's opposed to what has historically been known under the same name. Now, the only reason I add that and the only reason I want to amplify this is that not only did Van Til deny the coherence theory of truth, and there's another great quote, it's a longer one, I won't read it, where he takes on Kant and Hegel directly and rejects their conceptions of coherence. But not only did Van Til reject a coherence theory of truth, but he said we can call our view, beginning with the self-conscious, fully self-conscious triune God, we can call that a correspondence theory of truth if we thoroughly critique and reject what has historically been set forth under that name. So all I was wanting to get at, and I felt like we covered it fine, Camden, but I appreciate this brief little window here. Van Til denied both the idealist coherence theory and the realist correspondence theory as traditionally presented. And he did it for reformed theological reasons. And I just wanted to hit that quote, highlight it. I know we covered that, but I thought that quote was good. And it, like I said, if I repeated it, I'm so sorry, but hey, it's a quote good enough to repeat if I did. So sorry if I did.
No worries. Scott, do you ever thought much about that? I know you've done some work on Van Til and idealism and British absolute idealism, even looking at a lot of the historical sources and the context in which Van Til was working. I'm looking forward to a future conversation down the road where we might be able to talk about some of the results of your research and the fruits of that labor. But offhand, do you have any thoughts? Were you able to listen to any of the episode, or what were some of your thoughts in response to the conversation?
Yeah, and I would say that I agree and listened to the whole episode, really enjoyed it. And I think the discussion on coherence versus correspondence theory of truth is one of the areas where you can see Van Til entering into what's classically a philosophical discussion, but doing so with a robustly theologically informed and particularly a reformed approach to philosophy centering on the sovereignty of God. And so that means a total reorienting of his categories. I actually lecture on this to students over at the seminary, and when we make them go through the Van Til Reader, Bahnsen has a very helpful set of selections in the Van Til Reader where you see his comments about correspondence theory and coherence theory. And I think most philosophers, if they read what Van Til said, yeah, exactly, the good starting place for Van Til.
That's where I cut my teeth. Yeah.
Which is a side comment, and it amazes me that so many people that criticize Van Til, when you read their criticism, it's like you didn't even clearly read Bahnsen because he has a section on this and would have helped. But that's a side comment. I think a lot of people would classify Van Til as some form of a coherence theory because of the way he talks about truth having to correspond to God and what he says. But the fact of the matter is, Van Til rejects both theories as classically formulated because they're not sufficiently God-centered. And so Van Til's revelational epistemology comes out in the fact that he even finds it difficult to use either terms as they're historically used. He clearly rejects the Kant, Hegel, the F.H. Bradley, the Josiah Royce, that sort of tradition. He also rejects clearly the Aristotelian tradition. And I think he will pull terms that are often associated with the coherence theory because that realist and empiricist tradition has a inherent givenness to it. If truth corresponds to, there's a tree outside the window, whether God says it or man says it, it doesn't matter. For Van Til, he's bringing the creator-creature distinction even into the conversation about coherence and correspondence. And so I agree with Lane, and that's trying to fit Van Til into either classical category. He's really not going to, and he can say, in some sense, I believe in correspondence. In some sense, I believe in coherence. But the main thing for Van Til is truth corresponds to or coheres with God and his interpretation of the world, as he is the criterion for truth itself. And I think so many people just miss that.
I was trying to bring up in the episode, I think it came through clear enough, but rather than thinking of Van Til looking at the correspondence theory or coherence theory and then borrowing portions of them and replanting them in a Christian worldview, I think it's a lot more helpful and accurate to say that the correspondence theory and the coherence theory have stolen from the Christian worldview in order to try to make sense of their own. So if we do find, forgive the pun or forgive the reuse here, any correspondence with Christianity in the correspondence theory or any coherence at all, however weak, in the coherence theory, it's because they're borrowing from the Christian worldview. So insofar as Van Til might ever use those words, he's completely using them thinking originally as a Reformed Christian, not as an idealist student trying to, reinterpret his Bible according to idealist ideas.
Yeah, Camden, I thought that point you made was so spot on. It almost warranted a separate mini bucket. In the sense that when you look at what Van Til is approaching idealism with, at base, it's a confessional doctrine of God and man, enriched particularly by his reading of Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics, Voss's Reformed Dogmatics as they were developing, and he was sitting under him. And of course, the facts in relation are going to be found in the mind of God, ordered by the decree of God, and given their coherence by God, and they correspond to him, to his knowledge, to his plan. And so let's just put it this way. God reveals himself in Eden to Adam as such a God, and then thousands of years later, along come the idealists. Right. What are they doing? Yeah. They're trying to borrow, and the realists too. They're trying to borrow, maybe even semi-Jenga style, to invoke our episode. And I thought you were dead on. I thought that warranted almost a separate bucket. So maybe we can just call that bucket 4.
Sure,
I liked it.
Well, thanks. And it shouldn't be. It's really, when you understand what Van Til is saying, it's not really that complicated. It should just fall into place as a Reformed thinker. So we believe the triune God of the Bible is the only God, and that he's the center of all things. He created all things, and everything depends on him. Does anyone disagree with that? No Christian disagrees with that. Okay, let's take that as our first point. Okay, and then everything follows after that. So then, isn't it true that everything needs to correspond to that triune God, who's the foundation of all existence and all truth? And shouldn't everything then correspond to what he says and to what he thinks and what he's decreed? Okay, if that's true, then anything we see in the world, if it has any resemblance of any logical consistency, again, however weak, however frail, it can't be right, and it can't be original. It has to be stolen. It's stolen from reality, which is God's reality. That's really all we're talking about when we're talking about borrowed capital or stolen capital. And so when you have Van Til's illustration of, the little girl sitting in her dad's lap and slapping him in the face, that the illustration's meant to show that even the unbeliever who is offending God or rejecting him or blaspheming him is held up. The only reason she can reach her dad's face is because he's holding her. And the only reason an unbeliever can even try to mount an argument against the existence of God is because he's standing on God's foundation to do it. Amen. Which is ridiculous, and all the more reason for warranting, the wrath that he deserves. But that it really does, when you boil it all down, when you distill it, Van Til, it really does just come down to these basic Sunday school lessons that really shouldn't be that complicated, in my opinion. No, the issue is good. For one reason or another, it does become difficult for people for whatever reason, the way Van Til writes, or I don't know. We can talk about that, but Lane.
What you're saying? Oh, go ahead, Lane.
Oh no, let's free flow.
I was just going to say what you're articulating there, Camden. Van Til, who people say is real hard to understand. He put it even more succinctly, that atheism presupposes theism,
right?
And that is a dynamite thesis in 3 words,
right?
And as a follow-up to this, we're thinking about how Van Til's been received, why he's so hard for people to understand. We're seeking to engage charitably our brother Dr. Mathison, and we had a question here. I want to get to some questions that are on topic here. Mr. Riley asks, of any public critics of Van Til, which comes the closest, in your opinion, to really understanding his thought?
I'll give that a shot, and I want to try to speak as charitably as I can and as commendably as I can about Dr. Mathison's published critique. Here's what I can say. I think we said this, but I'll say it again because we need to say these things. The first half of his book, I can nitpick here and there, but the first half of his book is a really solid exposition of the basics of Van Til. He gets right that Van Til is not a correlativist like some of his interpreters. He doesn't believe in covenantal properties or a second mode of existence. He maps out Van Til's views of revelation, of man, of sin, of Christ. And I've had numbers of people say to me, and I had the same experience reading through the first portion of that book, he really did a commendable job getting the basics, the 101 building blocks of Van Til right. And you've got to appreciate that. And we shouldn't just say that and then go critique. We really should say that. In fact, I believe Carlton Camden and I lamented the fact that we couldn't sit there and say more positive things about the book, because there's a lot to say that's positive about that volume. And so I think, as far as I'm aware, now I'm trying to think back to the De Boers, to Van der Stelt, to Sproul, to Fesco, and almost all of them.
Even Frame is presented as a Van Tilian, but he's still a critique.
Called himself,
critic,
right? Or a fuzzy Van Tilian.
Yeah. No,
I think those were his words, right? I didn't come up with that.
He's the friendliest critic. I do remember that. Fuzzy, there's an episode on that right there, but maybe a separate episode. But
I don't mean to speak ill. I was
no.
Make a joke.
I know you weren't. I know you weren't. I'm serious that we could do a evangelical reunion style critique of him. But I think of all the critics of Van Til, and like I'm saying, I might be wrong because this is all live and I haven't checked my sources, but I think Keith, Dr. Mathison, is the only one who has done a full-orbed exposition of the system in the first section of his book to try to show plausibly, I've taken my time to look at the primary sources. I've read him, and here's what I say. So that being said, I think Dr. Mathison's work excels the most in that area. And then we've taken our first foray into the second portion of the book where he starts to critique Van Til. And as I read him, centers as most basic the propositional influence of idealism on him. And then everyone's heard that critique. So I would say, in response to that question, particularly in the first half of his book roughly, I would say Dr. Mathison.
Yeah, probably. Was there anything in Jerusalem and Athens, any critiques there that we think, now those are shorter. I'm not remembering offhand in my copies in the other room, but I'm wondering if there's any critique there of more sympathetic, or at least people that understood him thoroughly, but still might have disagreed. I'm not remembering. Do you remember anything? Yeah. Might be worth looking at, though.
Yeah, it's like I said, it's worth thinking about.
Yeah, if you bracket Jerusalem and Athens, and you look at Fesco's criticism, if you look at Lindsay, Sproul, and Gerstner, and if you look at Jesse and Cecil DeBoer, James Dane, the whole kind of panoply of either journal articles or monographs dedicated to criticizing Van Til, I think on two ways. What Lane was saying in terms of Dr. Mathison's book is the only book that gives a extended attempt at exposition of Van Til before giving criticism. And you have to say that he totally accurately talking about Van Til and classical theism and no correlativity. He got some of the main things correct, but he also got some of the details correct. And so he was very sympathetic in his attempt to understand Van Til. But even in his criticism, when he talks about a propositional influence of idealism in Van Til, he very clearly talks about the fourth category of systemic influence, and he clearly denies that, which almost every other critic would affirm that. And even look at some of the ways like the epistemological holism, which is the real area that Mathison kind of keys in to try to criticize Van Til. If you compare that to, say, Fesco's criticism of Van Til on common notions, well, you can look at the common notions issue and see that Fesco's reading is just categorically missing the nuance and the distinction of Van Til, whereas I agree with the panel that I think Mathison misread the epistemological holism issue, but you can at least say, hey, this is an area where interpretation needs to be done. So even the criticism, while it needs to be dealt with, is attempted to be done in a fair way that you really don't find from any of other Van Til's public critics. So I agree. This is the best book so far.
Yeah, that's good, Scott. I want to ask a follow-up to that, and I'm keeping an eye on the chat. Ryan is too. Why is it that there are these perennial critiques? The critics of Van Til, or people that haven't read Van Til, will say, well, if everyone always says these same things, they've been doing it since the 40s, then they must be right, correct? Like if a guy keeps getting charged with idealism, for example, well, how could people be making the same mistake over and over and over? They must be right. So how would you respond to that? What are some thoughts on the reason that Van Til keeps being the object of all of these criticisms, even though the Van Til himself dealt with all this, I thought, very thoroughly in his own life? But then we've been talking about this stuff for the 17 years that Christ the Center's been on the internet. Yeah.
I've got two initial thoughts and a few subsidiary ones may follow. I don't want to talk too long. But number one, if you do not, I studied, in a former life, I wanted to do a PhD in philosophy. And one of my great interests was continental philosophy. And I want to say something. If you are not a student of the primary sources of continental philosophy, their conception of dynamically reciprocal internal relations, their doctrine of a living, evolving, all-inclusive system that is constituted by all its relations, the idea of reality being this progressive, unified, organic unfolding of Geist, these are very difficult concepts to get your mind around. They're very strange. American philosophers don't tend to understand some of the interior dynamic features of German philosophy in general, and idealism more particular, in whether it's German or British or American absolute idealism. And so it's unless you've lived in it, it's hard to understand. That's point one. Secondly, when I was in seminary, Bob Godfrey, in our doctrine of the early, in our ancient church course, he asked students questions about justification and sanctification. They got them right. And then he started asking questions about the Trinity and about the person of Christ. And what happened was that we found out that the majority of the students in the class were either modalists, tritheists, Nestorians, or Eutychians. They were heretics. And Godfrey told us that in the Western theological tradition, you're going to find, by and large, people who have their I's dotted and their T's crossed in soteriology, covenant theology, Lord willing, but they're not going to be clear on doctrine of God and the creator-creature relation. Well, guess where Van Til camps out? Right there. He is all over it. The volume I wrote a while back, the things we've taught on, the things all of us have worked on. Van Til is a theologian of the Trinity, first and foremost. And now combine those two things. And let me make it a little more clear. Take a guy who says, okay, God is our concrete universal. And by that, I mean, God is eternally living, immutable, and self-complete in relations of subsistence and coherence. I just throw that out there. And what is the initial reaction of people with some training in these areas? It's like this. What? In other words, there's not only is Van Til a very advanced theological mind, one of the great ones of the 20th century, but he's dealing with issues that in the nature of the case are recalcitrant to those steeped in more or less American philosophy, and recalcitrant to those who are obsessed with the doctrine of the Bible, battle for the Bible in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, or soteriology. And when you add to the fact that he's writing in a second language, I think there is just a depth dimension that very easily makes people draw conclusions that are premature, somewhat immature, and are just missing the depth of everything he's addressing. And so when we talked about Dr. Mathison, we were saying it feels like to us, not only has Dr. Mathison missed some of these deeper structures in idealism, internal relations, holism, and so on, but he's also missed the deep structures of Van Til's critical engagement with idealism. And it seems like that's just the nature of the case, given the unfamiliarity most people have with the philosophy and the theology, and the depth at which Van Til's hitting it while writing in a second language. That's my general thought.
And I think that point you make about writing in a second language. So Van Til has written clearly throughout his corpus in God and the Absolute, and Christianity and Idealism, and everything in between, everything that you would need to know about Van Til's approach to idealism.
Mhm.
But the fact that he was doing it in a second language meant that he does not necessarily do a service to himself in his organization. So, for instance, if you look at J. Gresham Machen's Christianity and Liberalism, he's going to criticize liberalism, and the chapters are that it's on the doctrine of God, God and man, the Bible, Christ, salvation, and the church, very clearly, systematically laid out. If you go to God and the Absolute, his thesis is absolutely clear. But then when he starts talking about pragmatism and interacting with these kind of very niche, lesser known figures that might have been known in his day but aren't in our day, and he's just kind of working through their ideas, and unless you have, as Lane was saying, a real macro level understanding, and not only of philosophy, but of that era, you can't really follow what Van Til is saying. If you read it enough times, it becomes evident. But his organization, I mean, it was like having bricks of gold just kind of scattered about in a drawer, and you have to do your own kind of organization of them. And I think that does make
like
it
Ryan's
easy
house.
for people. Yeah, it does make it easy for people to lift one term. Oh, he used concrete universal, so therefore he's mired in Hegelian pantheism. Or, oh, he uses a transcendental argument, so clearly he's totally a Kantian. And I think it also, the fact that people did not understand the people that he was interacting with, and they also haven't gone back, which is some of the work I'm doing for my further work in the doctoral dissertation, on the influences that he had at seminary, and A.A. Bowman and Charles Wistar Hodge and Harry Jellema. There's this whole world that existed for a fairly limited amount of time in terms of philosophical vocabulary that if you go to the standard philosophical textbooks, they're not going to talk about because it wasn't mainstream. And so it makes it very hard with his organization for people to even really comprehend what he's saying.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
You know, a book that I read back in seminary, this is really stretching me. It's making me feel at least young. but I remember picking up around 1990 when Bonson was having us study idealism. I found at a used bookstore for like $5 a hardback copy of G. Watts Cunningham, The Idealist Argument in Recent British Philosophy. I think that's the title.
Yeah.
So it's just somewhere. This is a 30-year-old, 57-year-old memory trying to remember 30 years back. But that book is a really helpful documentation of primary sources. And then if you're so inclined, which I did this, you'll buy the books that he references and you'll start reading those, and then you're into it. But thankfully we've got Scott doing work on this, and he can serve this up for us in a dissertation one of these days.
Well, Lane, you might remember back in the day, it was probably around 2008. So I was working on a paper in seminary about Van Til and his interactions with the De Boers in the not Torch and Trumpet.
Calvin Forum.
Calvin Forum. Yeah. Not TNT, but Calvin Forum. So I I'm looking at these sources, and I go to the Westminster Library, obviously, because I'm a student there, and pull out some of these sources. I pull out Cunningham's book, start looking through it, and I'm like, who wrote all over this thing? Like, it's all notes in the margins, everything. And I start to realize, I think this is Van Til's writing. And I took it to Grace Mullen, the archivist at the time, and she's confirmed, yes, this is Dr. Van Til's writings. A lot of his books, when he passed away, were donated to the seminary. So I ended up with a copy of Cunningham, and Van Til's marginalia in the book became a primary source in my paper. So I had to go, talk to some librarians and figure out how to cite this according to Chicago Turabian. Like, I found marginalia in a book. Like, so what is that? Where do I put my commas and periods and dates and all that kind of stuff in this citation? So it just goes to show. I mean, Van Til loved that book too and used it extensively, and he demonstrated even in his marginalia how much he was an active reader and how much he understood, but he was always interacting with these different philosophies from a critical mindset. And I don't mean that in a Kantian way. I mean, he was reading them critically as a Reformed Christian, frequently putting in exclamation points, no exclamation points, circling things, writing. He's always interacting with things and reading, not passively, but actively, the way you really ought to be reading when you're doing philosophy or theology.
Yeah. That's a great story, Camden. I remember you told me that. And that's what disappointed me. We pointed this out about some early Van Til scholarship from 1990 in a work entitled The Consistency of Van Til's Methodology. He simply did not take idealist principles and replant them into the soil of Christian theology. Just seeing that book, Camden, I bet, was a great reminder of that fact. He was saying no.
Nine.
So anyway,
other problems here.
Yeah.
No, that's important. What are some other issues that came up? Any other comments or thoughts, Scott? I'm especially interested to hear things you're working on or any response you might have had to our episode. Lane, Ryan, no doubt you've been hearing some things. Did we get any emails today, Ryan?
No, not yet.
Yeah,
but perhaps over the weekend, and hopefully, well, not the Lord's Day. People are gonna not email us then, but we'll likely get some feedback, especially as this picks up too.
Yeah,
the projected.
Why don't you tell us about the sale, because we haven't mentioned that yet.
Oh yeah, just real briefly. If you want to read the very best book on Van Til's Trinitarian theology that underpins his entire apologetic method, here it is by Dr. Lane G. Tipton, 40% off in our store. We've talked a lot about it.
How much off?
40% off.
How much off is it?
Yeah, so it's $34.99 MSRP. You can get it for $20.
Can you send me the link?
That includes free shipping. Free shipping every day at Reformed Forum for U.S. customers.
U.S. customers, yeah, 40%. That's a great deal. We still have quite a few copies of that. I think we ordered 3,000 when we bought it. When we ordered it, and we got Scott.
We also have Scott Hatch's book at 40% off on Van Til's ethics.
And Scott's going to be giving a talk soon is it in Virginia? Let me look up the page. He's giving a book talk on that book. Yeah. That's going to be Friday, or no, not Friday, but February 15th. I don't know what day of the week that is at Christ Presbyterian Church Burke, PCA. That's Redeeming Grace Church. That's 5200 Ox Road in Fairfax, Virginia, on February 15th. If you're around, it's going to be from 7:30 to 9 p.m. Scott wrote that book, Van Til and the Foundation of Christian Ethics, but that book also includes the only version of this, but a critical edition of Christian theistic ethics. So Scott did a great work in scholarship to compile that and compare all the various versions of it and then put them all together into a critical version so you can see all the different layers. Yeah. It's like in geology when you take a cross section of the earth and you can look at all the different sediment layers. Yeah. You can do that with Van Til's work there. So that includes not quite half, but it's a good chunk of that book is Van Til's own work there. So if you don't have that, get a copy of that too. And we're running a sale on that today too.
Yeah, 40% off.
40% off of that too. So just order both of them. Order 10 of both of them.
Hey, Camden, I had one thought that I just wanted to raise. Carl's not with us. So I've commended the observation you made about borrowed capital. That's huge. I think that frames everything. Another thing I really appreciated about the episode, Carlton led off by a careful analysis of Van Til's language that in order for a person to know anything, he must know everything.
Yeah, right.
And I'll tell you what I really appreciated about that. Carlton brought this out and we developed it. At base, that's Van Til's critique of Adam's false ideal of knowledge that he had to postulate in order to justify eating from the forbidden fruit. He had to assume in practice his own omniscience in order to eat from the tree that the omniscient God told him, the day you eat, in dying, you will die. And I really think that helps you see just how deep Van Til's critique goes. And I don't know if I added this. I don't remember because we said a lot. But, you can say that in Van Til's mind, that postulate, in order for man to know anything, he must know everything. That postulate is an apostate postulate for Van Til. It is what Adam presupposed in the fall. But secondly, and I think if you look at various forms of absolute idealism, that apostate postulate is what is centrally enshrined in the correlativity of absolute idealism. Because if the absolute can come to full self-consciousness, just to take the Bradley quote, I'll read this real quickly, just to take the Bradley quote and bring this together. Bradley 466 of Appearance and Reality says this, quote, if I can find it, quote, everything, myself included, is essential to and inseparable from the absolute, end of quote. So all relations are essential to and inseparable from the absolute. And if the absolute is going to come to full self-consciousness, think in Hegelian terms here, if he's going to reach an omega point where he has perfectly exhaustive, universal, and particular knowledge at the end of the process, then so will all incorporated into it. And so I think what Van Til's really wanting us to see is that apostate Adamic assumption finds perhaps its grandest expression in absolute idealism. And so far from affirming that postulate, Van Til is the most radical critic of it, whether it's Adam in the Garden of Eden or whether it's F.H. Bradley and G.W.F. Hegel and the absolute idealist tradition. And Carlton really brought that out, I thought, nailed it in a helpful way. I thought it was beautiful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I thought that was great. Scott, we've got a question for you. We'll see if you want to answer it or not, but this is from Jacob. He asks, are there ways one would need to modify Van Til's argumentation to answer contemporary apologetic objections? In other words, he writes, or here's a follow-up, do any features of his thinking need reworking for today? I'll let you take that any way you want or reframe the question if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. And Jacob's actually one of my students at the seminary, so I have to get on to him for asking such a hard question. Yeah, I think if I can borrow the category of substance and accidents, I think the substance of Van Til's apologetic method is what we need to be doing today. We need to be doing for our generation the same thing that Van Til was doing, rigorously applying the absolute independence of God, the creator-creature distinction, applying that to epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics. One thing I will say that in terms of some of the accidental properties or ways in which we apply Van Til is that because of where Van Til was in his time, he was primarily dealing with questions of metaphysics and epistemology. I think in our day and age, most of the assaults of unbelief upon the church, though certainly we have the same sort of assaults that Van Til was, we have this whole new field of cultural challenges to Christianity. And so I think our main focus in translation is going to be probably dealing more with epistemology and ethics. If you think about all the things, accusations about Christianity being oppressive and things of this nature that you find in our culture. So I think we're going to have to find a way to translate Van Til's categories more into an ethical focus. And I'm not saying Van Til did not do that ever in his corpus, but there are some things we're dealing with, say transgenderism or critical race theory, that we're going to have to take that same method and apply. And I do think it would probably be worthwhile to consider a change in terminology on some things like limiting conceptions, concrete universal, things of that nature, which in Van Til's day, the scholars he was dialoguing with spoke in that same sort of terminology. Now we're finding that's not the case. If you go into a atheistic philosophy room here at Clemson University, right down the road from me, and you say God is a concrete universal, the person is going to look at you and say, what are you talking about? That's something that's totally, and I think we need to explain what that means, but I think we are going to have to find ways to change that, modify that, and apply it to a new set of problems minimally. And, you could take a whole episode on answering this question, but I think minimally, that's some of the things in the Van Tilian community that we're going to have to do, changing some of the terms and also changing some of the focus in order to deal with contemporary challenges.
I agree. I think that's a great way to put it, Scott. I think what Van Til himself was an interpreter in many ways of consistent Reformed confessionalism and applying it to a particular time and place. But it's not as if the substance or what he's interpreting needs to be tossed out or reworked per se. But perhaps there are better and more effective ways to communicate those same exact lessons given our particular cultural moment and whatever reigning philosophy there is, the zeitgeist, presently speaking. But I don't think that, I still think there's absolutely great value and applicability in studying Van Til on his own terms. And when you understand him, all that can be applied. It's not as if, we need to rewrite all of Van Til's main works, because once you get to the system, the core of it, it becomes pretty obvious how that applies to whatever situation you're dealing with. But some of the window dressing might change, some of the phrases might change. But again, if we believe that Christianity is true, then that doesn't change. And if unbelieving philosophies are stealing capital from the Christian view rather than vice versa, then we can always take our marching orders and our source material from the Word of God and speak into whatever culture we're living in. And that's always safe, and that's always going to work, so to speak. I'm not a pragmatist here, but it's always going to be applicable and useful.
I think Van Til is always going to be useful because he, in my estimation, beyond any other apologist, sought to be radically consistent with Scripture and what it teaches about the basic doctrines that we all need to know in order to love God and love our neighbor and obey his law. The doctrine of God, the doctrine of man, the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of salvation. And as we survey the 21st century landscape with all the craziness of transgenderism and socialism everywhere, the basic problems haven't changed in terms of the spiritual man, not discerning, not understanding the things of God, because he hates God and he holds the truth in unrighteousness. And I bring this up because a friend, Mr. Graham Dugas, he said he'd like to hear some thoughts on the limits and nature of human language regarding these things. And in particular, he brings up the passage I was alluding to in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 13 and 14. I recall, was it Dr. Gaffin who had a tremendous article on that, seeking to provide the exegetical, some of the exegetical foundations for Van Til's apologetic?
Some epistemological reflections on 1 Corinthians 2, 6 through 13.
Yeah, that was in the book you co-edited.
Mm-hmm.
It was I guess the second time that got published. It started off in the WTJ, I think, didn't it?
Yeah. Quick thought on that before I run out. Yeah. It is among the top 5 best things Gaffin ever wrote. Yeah. It is stellar. It's just stellar. Quick thought on that. I think that that text brings into view mostly, but not entirely, mostly, what occurs at the time point of the beatific vision, Westminster Larger Catechism 90. That when we enter into heaven, when we're received up into heaven, filled with inconceivable joy, see the glory of the triune God radiating from the face of Jesus Christ, we have not conceptualized or conceived those things because they lie on the far side of the eschaton, on the other side, as it were. It's the not yet. But I would say this, and I'll just leave you brothers to refine this. We could look at Gaff and a whole host of other things. The Lord has revealed himself to us with sufficient clarity for us to know and teach these things. Yet, at every point, we will find proper limits of mystery given our creatureliness. So I would say that these things are sufficiently clear and plain, some of them very plain for us to understand the creator-creature relation. But it's always, when we press it far enough, going to reveal the incomprehensible mystery of an immutable triune God relating to us through mutable created media, revealing his glory in its incomprehensible fullness, so that we might worship him and not try to resolve all mysteries and so on. So the 1 Corinthians 2:13 text, I'd place toward the beatific vision side. Brothers, I do have to run. I'm so sorry to go.
No,
but
no worries, Lane. Thanks for popping in.
Carry on. Thank you, brothers, so much. And Camden, I can't wait for our next installment. Scott, Ryan, good to see you guys. Sorry to cut out.
Great. Thanks, Lane.
That was fun. I'm glad he could join us. Yeah. Any follow-up to that? I think that's an excellent point.
No, I think that was really well said. And you know, the limitations of human language in dealing with God until that time when we have the beatific vision is why continuing to do the work of theology in every generation is so important, because as wonderful as the treasures we have are, we are not this side of the beatific vision going to be able to exhaust everything that we can say or try to refine and say more properly until that day when our faith becomes sight in the beatific vision. And so, you know, it's why the continued work of theology is so important, but it's why all Christians should be longing for that day of the beatific vision.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Any final comments? I know we're running a little late and don't want to keep you too long, Scott. And Ryan and I've got families to get to eventually, but this has been fun. But I, at least want to open things up if there's any final words to be said. All right. Well, go.
Yeah, Scott. I want to hear Scott.
Yeah. I'd just say one final thing that didn't come up in the episode, but I want to just kind of throw out there and maybe I'll address later, is that as you talk about Christianity and idealism, or Van Til and idealism, I thought that one of the areas, in addition to everything that y'all brought up about this chapter, was that Dr. Mathison had a deficient view of what idealism was. If you look at what he says on page 144, for instance, talking about the main point is that philosophy of the Reformed theologians of the 16th and 17th century was generally a realist philosophy. In terms of metaphysics, that means that the real world is what it is, regardless of what humans think of it. In terms of epistemology, that means that humans are able to have true knowledge of this real world. In short, realism is the view that the real world is independent of our human minds. I thought that was a very deficient view, and particularly him putting Platonism and Aristotelianism side by side. He will bring that pairing up back at the end of the book, saying that Van Til departs from the Reformed tradition, because the Reformed tradition is either Aristotelian or Platonist, and both of these are realist, whereas Van Til is introducing idealism as an alien philosophy. I thought that was really kind of flat and lacking in nuance. So, for instance, if you compare Plato and Aristotle, Plato argued that the material world that we see isn't real. It's just a shadow projection of the real, which is the eternal realm of the forms, and that you don't learn by the process of empiricism. You learn by the process of remembering through knowledge kind of implanted in your soul and knowledge of the forms in that way. And to compare that to Aristotle, who basically said truth is correspondence, two states and affairs in the world, and you judge the correspondence by your senses. It seemed to me to try to put those two things side by side that really don't go together. Yes, both of them were realists as opposed to nominalists, but Plato really should be classified as an idealist. And so for him to build this argument that, well, the Reformed tradition used Plato, it used Aristotle, but the sources that Van Til uses are totally outside of the realm of Reformed historiography, I thought showed a weakness in his point of lack of nuance on the term of idealism and the history of it, both in the Reformed tradition and philosophy in general.
Yeah.
And I think that contributes to his lack of detailed interaction with Van Til on this point. So that's the only thing I'd offer in addition.
No, that's a great point. I'm thankful you brought that up. I think, again, it shows that Van Til is rejecting both realism and idealism, but there are slight elements in which both realists and idealists have stolen from the Christian worldview to make sense of their own. Van Til is rejecting realism in this sense because a realist in the formats that have been that Mathison is referring to really are atheistic in many senses, that the world just kind of is what it is. And Van Til would say, no, the world is what it is because of God's eternal decree and because of his consistent sustenance of that. The whole world is held up by the word of his power. And so it's not realism proper in a secular way, but if all we're saying is, does the world exist independent of the way we think about it? Yeah, absolutely. Like my mind is not creating the world proper. I have an interpretation. I interact with the world, but I'm not bringing in classical idealist formulations the categories that make sense of the world and therefore construct the world by my own ideas or thoughts. No. Okay. But then what about idealism? Well, we've spent a lot of time, now about 3 hours worth about talking about Van Til and idealism, but the world doesn't correspond to my ideas or my mind, but the world, we might say, in some very twisted idealist way, they've stolen from the Christian worldview because the world does depend on God's mind and his continuing decree and his sustaining the world by the word of his power. That's not idealism, but idealism is stolen from the Christian worldview to make sense of their own. There were some other philosophers, much later. I don't know if it was Berkeley or Leibniz and Spinoza. Some of these other guys are all remixing ideas kind of like this, and they're false ideas as well, but they're ideas in which there is a God or a universal mind or something like that is the foundation for the world. Those are also twisted truths. They're not the truth as we find it in reality or as we find it revealed in Scripture. So Van Til is rejecting both realism and idealism, but that doesn't mean that he therefore, if rejecting realism, is rejecting the notion that the world exists independent of human minds. You see, that's the error, I think, that happens. So Van Til says, I'm not a realist. And then people conclude, well, then he means he must reject the idea that the world's independent of our thoughts, and therefore he must be wrong. No, he's a Christian. and Christians don't need to accept the categories, the philosophical categories that are available to them from the secular world. That's the big error. We need to take our marching orders from the Word of God and primarily develop our categories according to what it says. And then insofar as we see borrowed or stolen capital in an unbelieving worldview, we can point that out. But we always need to be directing our conversation partners back to what the Word teaches and take our categories from there. So Anyway, thus ends my rant. Hey, Ryan, you have any thoughts?
Well, no, I was just going to say this is what Brother Michael Riley said in the comments.
Yeah.
He said the core of Van Til is answering philosophical questions with the absolute conviction of the truth of Reformed theology. Most of his critics assume that the philosophical categories are basic and thus can't make sense of Van Til on his own terms.
Yeah, that's helpful. We appreciate that. Well, guys, it's probably time to try to wrap things up. Let's remind everyone of the little sale we've got because it's apropos.
Yeah.
So we have 2 books, 40% off: The Trinitarian Theology of Cornelius Van Til, and then Van Til and the Foundation of Christian Ethics, the former written by our friend Lane Tipton, who was just on a minute ago, and then the latter by our friend Scott Hatch. And again, he's going to be speaking about that book on February 15th in Fairfax, Virginia. Information is available online at reformedforum.org for that. So that's great. And then also the brand new book, Union with Christ, The Benefits of His Suffering and Glory by Lane Tipton. Head over to Amazon for this one. We'll have that eventually for sale in our store as well. But the simplest, fastest, most direct way for you to order this is right from Amazon.com. And in addition to that, if you're not in the U.S., this should be available globally. So it's in all the different global marketplaces, Amazon.de, .es, .co.uk, you name it. So if you're looking for Lane's latest, you can get a copy of that, and it should be available to you if you've got an internet browser. That's been fun. Thank you so much, Ryan, for taking the time and out of your busy day to come on over, and you too as well, Scott. We appreciate catching up with you. We'll have to have you back soon. I'd love to catch up with you more frequently, but it's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's always a privilege to be with you all.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
amen. Well, I'm going to wrap things up. Again, everyone, head on over to reformedforum.org for information about everything we have going on. Subscribe to the email newsletter. And comment, and we'll try to respond or at least address your comments and your questions in future episodes. We're intending for the time being to be live 4 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Central on youtube.com/Reformed Forum whenever we're in town, and sometimes when we're not. So get your schedules in order. And when you're wrapping up and closing up shop at the end of a busy work week, if you've got the ability to put an earbud in or something like that while we're live, we'd love to have you listen along and ask your questions. So thanks everybody for watching and for listening. We'll catch you next time on Reformed Forum Live.
Nice, that was fun.
Let me hit stop on the recording. All right, fun. Thanks, brother. Yeah,
that was great.
Kept you